Oh, here we go. My DMU slash Tuskegee slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Now I feel like I'm getting good at this. I have to have two screens, but I think that like now I can um, adequately share on Zoom. So last week I posed these two questions to the group, and I just wanted to return momentarily to these two questions that I posed last week. I don't know if some of you have perhaps taken some time to reflect on these questions and what they might mean for you. I feel like it's really important to kind of reflect on the early motivations, maybe that brought you here, that have now kind of solidified you being in this program, but maybe have their roots in something that is much earlier in your life experience. So for me, reflecting on these two questions, helped me realize that black space means any landscape, city, home, or intimate moment that is created by or occupied by Black people. The people come first and remake any container. And the fact that Black space is being created all the time and Black space is just being in time. So having my own practice in part was about getting back to some of these earlier foundations. I've always been interested in how people occupy space, what motivates them to construct the environments in the ways they do, and what that represents about us as a people. Um, so I'm often really interested in thinking about race as a social system and kind of provocative impetus for design. As the scholar Sarah Lewis has noted, seeing has become a mode of reading the world. We make meaning of what we see through conditioned sight, and the question becomes what conditions the mode of seeing. When it comes to race and equity, this has become increasingly important to understand. End quote. So as an architect, I examine racial constructs in the context of built constructions, where these kind of spatial metaphors act as mechanisms for connectedness and engagement. People are the activating agents in my work, and their presence is needed for a reconsideration or a reconditioning, to use Lewis's term, of our bodies in relation to one another. So as we know, race is a social construct based loosely on phenotype, or the observable ways in which our human species has responded to its environment over time. These classifications are not fixed. They morph depending on time, place, and predilection. They are slippery and continually shifting. Indeed, I'd be hard-pressed to say which race, quote unquote, race each of these people belong to. Yet, despite their uncertainty, racial groupings, of course, have real implications for our lived experiences. To paraphrase Chimamanda Adichie, there is danger in the single story. So if, as many have purported, race is a superficial fiction, then perhaps to deconstruct race is to consider how to disrupt this thin layered surface, while simultaneously investigating the substrates that support it. So this interest in surface and support is perhaps born of examining my own personal experience as a Black woman operating in a discipline that, despite our physical presence, and we are here, often feels like it only faintly registers my existence. So this evening, I'm going to talk a little bit more about my own work, because I kind of only touched on it a little bit last week, as well as show the work of a number of practitioners who are working, building, dreaming about, and changing the world today. We each have very different ways of looking at who we are, the field that we're in, and what we bring to the task of working in and on the built environment. So as I mentioned last week, I have a practice called Dream the Combine with my partner, Tom Carruthers. And I would say on the surface of things, our partnership negotiates a series of boundaries, transgressing the categorical separations of discipline, nationality. Tom is Canadian and British. Discipline, we're both architects, but he has a background in art. Gender, sex, and race. In a time of divisiveness and ossifying monocultures, affirmation of the both and rather than the either or is a conceptual stance that extends to the ethos of our practice. We work through combinatory modes, merging architecture with visual art and cultural theory to work productively with difference. So a lot of our projects engage with perception, specifically modalities of vision and movement, as a way to kind of consider the section of an image. So, like a section drawing obviously is cut, typically a vertical cut through an object or a structure. So it both reveals the kind of making of the surface, but also what's behind that plane, what's behind that skin. So each of our works kind of speaks to a gap or a space in history and the ways in which we think we know the world. Tom and I both acknowledge and are interested in how we see, so which is kind of a merger of the sensorial realities of biology, such as the saccades and fixations of the eye. And this is a diagram that shows a kind of series of maps of eye movements over an image when given various prompts. So, when kind of told to look at the image given this preceding statement, these are the patterns that your eye might make over that image. So this is like the reality of how we actually see, which illustrates that vision is both a kind of projective and a receptive system, with the mind making sense of the light information presented onto the eye. Light is mapped onto our retinas, and then those patterns are matched with a kind of mental schema through feedback loops of pattern recognition. So how, the kind of mechanical process of how we see, plus the socially constructed histories we carry, such as the continual terrorization of Black skin. And unfortunately, last week we saw more examples of that on the national stage. As well as the medium of the content, in this case, Alexandra Bell's reworking of the front page of the New York Times to tell a different story about Michael Brown. All of these things condition what we see. So the thing perceived then is a construction that we can unpack and inventively manipulate. The internal structure of the image becomes a space of exploration and risk. So we want our work to challenge the imagination, to complicate our known understanding of things, from architecture to the building blocks of infrastructure, to the systems and societal patterns that we might hold for granted. We are interested in figures and the grounds or territories in which they move, but not in a binary way or as a gradient between oppositions, but instead how these terms can get interwoven and enmeshed with one another, how our environment sculpts how we're seen and how we're seen sculpts our environment. Also how a flat surface can imply depth, or how architecture in its fixity and concreteness can open up arenas for multiple interpretations, flexibility, and chance. So Dream the Combine is a non-objective practice. We make things rather than objects, and I say the word things with some intentionality, that these are our installations are kind of relational structures that are meant to bring people together. So we set up dynamics in space that depend on audiences, their movements and interactions, their sense of curiosity, and their imaginative risk. Our works are invitations to performance. We've worked in rural landscapes, city streets, in transportation corridors, forest landscapes, and other types of property. The common thread is that people are the activating agents in the things that we make. Also, Tom and I make our own work. I think I'm wearing like all the patterns in the universe right there, and also using that disc grinder in a way that's like not safe. We took all the guards off, but we're committed to making physical things. We fabricate our own work as a way to more deeply integrate our intentions with the means in which they're realized, but we don't really consider ourselves a design-build practice. It's more about engaging with process as a necessary and kind of recursive component of the work. And we often describe our projects as kind of prepositional phrases, like these little bits of text and meanings. Really, they're sketches. And a preposition is a relational fragment, a word that sets up spatio-temporal interactions and correspondences between texts. It's an action before placement. It's a bridge in language. So I'm going to talk really briefly about two projects, and then I'm going to show the work of a lot of other people. So this first one, and I'll try and go quickly through this, is called Longing, which is both an emotional expression and a kind of verbal play on lengthening. And the site for this project, our practice mainly, we're trained as architects, but we make architectural installations. And so this was the site of this project, which is an abandoned pedestrian bridge that used to be part of this 8-mile-long network of elevated bridges in Minneapolis that connect all the buildings in downtown to each other. So this is like a 8-mile-long network. But when this one bridge was removed to make room for the light rail, a couple of enterprising architects bought this piece of infrastructure and moved it here on some city-owned property that is pretty close to the University of Minnesota campus, but also, probably more importantly, really close to this transcontinental railway. So we were interested in taking this piece, this fragment that's part of another system, and connecting it kind of to a new network of its own making. So first we removed these end walls and actually replaced them with kind of inward-facing mirrors. And so when you have two mirrors that face each other, you get a line that makes this kind of infinite reflection into the distance. And so the single fragment then becomes replicated out of its own instance. But instead of these mirrors being kind of fixed or just parallel to one another, we were really interested in what could happen when these mirrors start to move and flex with the wind. Oftentimes our projects explore things that are evident in drawing, but we make them as kind of physical structures, again, as a way of kind of making a section of an image. So here, the single point perspective of this kind of image converging to a point actually starts to wander and describe other kinds of shapes that might be impossible. So you get this kind of flexing, moving, searching form that repeats the surrounding environment and starts to kind of mess with your perception to a certain extent. These big mirrors are about 15 by 10 feet, 10 feet tall, 15 feet wide, and they basically act like giant sails. And so that video was taken during a windstorm here in Minneapolis, and so they will move and kind of shed the wind. And this is let me see if I can get my cursor. This is a kind of tensegrity structure that holds up this central basket and makes that stationary. And then the mirror and this long counterweight are kind of threaded through that basket. And so the counterweight and the mirrored plane are the parts that actually move. Yep. So that's another view from the back. So it had this kind of hidden quality about it, a little bit of mysteriousness, something that you kind of had to happen upon. We're really bad at like self-promotion, so we never like tell anybody when we like make anything, so people just sort of discovered this thing. And I'm going to play a short movie that talks a little bit about this piece, but it's not really a documentary about the artwork, but it's more of like a kind of another sort of remembering of what this piece was about. So maybe a little weird. I'm definitely operating at maybe at the edges of kind of traditional practice. But I think that's part of what this class is about, right? Like seeing lots of different ways in which people take their training as an architect and do lots of different things. So um, the second piece I wanted to talk about is called Hide and Seek, and it was at MoMA PS1, which is a big kind of contemporary art museum in New York. And our firm was nominated for this competition, and we were really honored actually just to be nominated, but we ended up winning the dang thing. So this was an installation that we did in a big kind of public courtyard in New York City. And so some of the things I'm going to show are kind of images from that competition proposal, and then also sort of final images from the project. We were presenting this to a bunch of art curators and not that many architects, so we decided to kind of start with something we knew they would probably understand a little bit more intuitively, which was an artwork, in talking about what sort of motivated us in this project. And this is a piece called Art Is by a performance artist, Lorraine O'Grady. And it was made in response to a friend who told her that conceptual art didn't care about Black people. So these notions of care, of conserving, of preserving, of tending are something very tender, and I think she took it really seriously, this criticism. And so this artwork was kind of her response to that comment. But she actually made the piece in 1983, but didn't start exhibiting photographs of the piece until 2005. So again, kind of reiterating that the importance was the presentness of the people who were here in this moment, and less about participating in the art market, for instance. But this piece was, she had 15 dancers who were all wearing white, and they were carrying these kind of gilt frames and moving through the crowd at an African American Day Parade in Harlem. And I think one of the things that we were really intrigued by and excited by with this project in particular is the sort of like canonizing gaze of this gilt frame, right? Like who belongs in the art historical canon, who is actually moving inside, outside, alighting this frame, but also the kind of direct address and the crossing of this frame, a kind of disavowal of the frame. This woman pointing directly at the camera, kind of putting the gaze back on the person who's actually taking the photograph. And we were also really interested in a number of the kind of framing devices that she uses, both as a kind of compositional artifact. These images are all like beautifully cropped and kind of exquisitely framed. Then the gilt frame itself as a kind of as a bounding element, but also the kind of presence of this police border separating people from the public space of the street. So for us, in thinking about this project in relationship to the site that we were given for this installation, this quotation became a really like guiding one for us. And the trick, of course, is this refusal of border under the constraint of border's constant imposition. So in this site, which was a 18,000 square foot exterior courtyard that was bounded by 16-foot high concrete walls, we really had to question the kind of existing condition of the site that we were given. Walls are two-faced. They can both kind of shelter and protect and enclose, but they can also shut people out and be very exclusionary. So our proposal then became a kind of provocation of the dual nature of this frame. So we wanted to insert something into the courtyard that had a kind of parasitic misalignment to the existing geometries there, but also created this kind of network that you couldn't escape. So in the previous piece, longing was sort of taking one instance and kind of replicating it through this kind of mirrored expansion. For hide and seek, because also of the compressed kind of timeline of working on this competition, this whole process is taking place in like less than a year. We were sort of working out of our own work and made, kind of multiple longings sort of all intersecting with one another in this courtyard. And so these little models start to physicalize that kind of void negative space described between those two mirrors as these kind of things that are piercing through the institution. So this is a quarter scale model that we made of the project, and this is some former students of mine at the University of Minnesota. And kind of any place where these bars sort of intersected the walls of the courtyard, we had these little doors that the jury could kind of take off and kind of peer down and look through the model. So again, it became a kind of like didactic tool about, some of the aspirations of the project. Oh, let me see if I can get back over here. And also, this is Emmy. She's one of my former students. She had the great task of 3D printing and hand painting all of the people who went into the scale model as a way of, again, kind of challenging us to think about how people gather, how people might be utilizing this space. And so this is the kind of final project. And I'll just cycle through some images of this so you can see sort of one line starts in one courtyard and sort of traverses the entire site and becomes a kind of space for these different programmatic activities to occur. So here's that same image of the wall now with our installation inserted. So in plan, this is kind of like a big long runway stage. This is a little seat. This is another secondary stage, and this is a big 18-foot by 27-foot hammock that people could kind of lounge in. So that's this space here. And we were really interested in, again, the kind of ambiguity of this space. Every point where these bars kind of intersected with the wall, we made these graphite murals, which were really just like rubbing kind of, basically graphite or pencil lead onto the wall surface, on the inside and the outside of the wall surface, kind of registering where this thing might be passing through the wall. But also there was a kind of like glitchiness that started to get introduced into this space. Maybe has some of the echoes and registers of the video that I just showed. Instances where a kind of solid wall appears to peel out and become a very thin plane, or bodies that get to be reorganized throughout this space. And you start to see behind you or see around a corner. bodies get reordered. Also, as another way of kind of transgressing the boundary of the courtyard, these trusses that were overhead started to connect certain spots inside the courtyard to those outside of it. So when you stand on this street corner, you can look up into this mirror, which bounces off of here, and you get a view inside the courtyard. And so here, this is looking back out to that street. We were interested in these kind of overheads or periscopes. We kept joking that we made like the largest periscopes ever made. That these periscopes also became a kind of carrier for water and mist, which introduced a sort of visual static into the scene of the installation. So there were like mist things that would pulsate sort of on and off at a kind of random interval. This is my nod to Prince, Purple Rain. But so this mist started to become a kind of literal watercolor at night. And this installation had to work for, when the courtyard was pretty empty. So maybe 15 people occupying an almost 20,000 square foot space. So these really kind of contemplative moments, but also when there would be these big parties every week, and there'd be about 5,000 people in this courtyard. And so I think this is really when the kind of piece started to really come alive, is through seeing the kind of replicated crowd and people just enjoying it and lounging in this space. And kind of playing off of hide and seek as a name of a childhood game, there's a really awesome double Dutch performance that happened on this big runway. And so when I returned to this earlier slide, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some people who I'm inspired by, kind of incredible peers who are dreaming and making and doing out in the world. Obviously my practice is like, I don't make buildings. I have, and I used to. I worked for about, 10 years in New York and London for various firms, Deborah Burke, David Adjaye, et cetera. But have, since starting our own practice, have really concentrated on working in this kind of public art installation space. And some of these folks do too. But while their images are kind of cycling, here I'll briefly talk about a few themes that these practices, including my own, loosely share. The work is highly entrepreneurial, born of hustle in various contexts. We're folks who just do the damn thing, finding opportunity where none seems to be made plain, finding creative expression in the margins of traditional practice. Our work is multivalent, operating at lots of different scales. Some make art, some make installations, some make buildings, some make cities. Most importantly, we're neither waiting to be asked nor asking for permission. Each of our we are teaching, designing, mentoring, and sharing within our local communities, but also while maintaining a global or systemic outlook. We're interested in communities, in making real changes where we are. We're interested in changing how our practice operates in lots of different ways. Our work is about public impact, whether it's a need to tell our stories, become part of a larger canon, or make meaningful physical change to our environments. Some imagine the future, others unearth the past. Some make buildings, others make art. There's an urgency, a boldness, and an incredible variety and creativity to this work. And I think so much of it is about finding our own voices in the spaces in which we're operating. Making spaces for people to gather, to have experiences, to make life changes. And I think they all take a very expansive view of kind of what's allowed, when we think about what it means to be an architect. So in closing, I'm going to talk really quickly about the work of Lauren Halsey, who was trained as an architect. I think she went to Cornell briefly and studied with Amanda Williams, but is now operating as an artist in South Central LA. And she's probably best known for this project, which was an installation called the Crenshaw District Hieroglyphic Project, which it was exhibited in the gallery, but also has its sort of analog in the sort of Crenshaw neighborhood. And she's been working a lot, really trying to kind of enact change and tell stories of her neighborhood. And so this piece has kind of the sort of simplicity of a kind of, Egyptian tomb or something like that. But the inscriptions on its surface are relevant to today. So another way of kind of inscribing in the surface of this thing, of this object, a certain kind of story. And I think what's really amazing about Lauren is not only does she make these kind of incredible artworks, but she is really rooted and invested in her community. And so she had really wanted to create this community center in South Central called Summit Everything. But with COVID, this community center is supposed to be located right next to her studio, her artist studio. And she speaks really eloquently about the ways in which she felt that she needed to do something kind of, sparked by the moment that we're in right now, sparked by COVID-19. So I'm going to let her describe it in her words, and this will be kind of the last thing I show, and then I can open it up for questions.
Food is a necessity. It's nourishment that we all need to live and survive. 95% of us in South Central knows very well this is a food desert, and I know very well that there's already a lack of resources here. So that compounded by the crisis of Corona, I thought, food would be the gesture that made sense. I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I became super committed to this idea of having a community center in my neighborhood for children and young adults that would support all sorts of intelligence for free at a very high level. When Corona became a thing and I realized that it would be impossible to open the community center as I had planned, initially I thought how cool it would be to go on a mini art vacation in my studio and experiment with concrete and foam. And about 2 days, 3 days into it, it felt a little off. And it felt like irresponsible a little bit to, dream up these beautiful images, representations of South Central, and that it made most sense to actually get to work. There has to be this other side of my practice that is about a tangible action and redistributing resources, material in a one-to-one way that's not about a representation of South Central in an art object. So I thought, let's fill people's refrigerators and keep them fed. I reached out to a friend from childhood that I went to middle and high school with, Karina, who has a background in food sustainability and environmental law and has been, plugged into farmers markets in LA since for as long, at least a decade or so. And we've been tapped in with really beautiful, local farmers for the past few weeks. We always have pineapple. We always have squash. We always have kale. We always have mixed lettuce heads. We always have citrus. We always have raspberries, strawberries. Always have mango, herbs, basil, chives. Just some of everything. Literally some of everything. Yeah. It's gotten so amazing that now we have a line of cars, people waiting for us. And I'm very excited about the quality, very excited that everything, was harvested, a few days ago, that it came from a farm, that it's from farm to lots. very excited about the consistency. And so a lot of the conversation that I have, you know, with folks on foot or in the car, I see you next week, da, 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 and you know I will. And that's been really beautiful.
So to the point of Black space existing in lots of different ways, it being created all the time, I think, um, I was also really struck by the way in which her practice has a much broader mission outside of itself. I didn't talk so much about my teaching today, but I try and do that um, through my teaching and in collaborations that I have in community here in Minneapolis. Um, Understanding that we can have lots of different interactions, lots of different ways in which we're talking about architecture, the ways it shows up, the way we bring ourselves to it, and the way we express ourselves, all different parts of our identities. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. And I want to open it up certainly to any questions and thoughts, provocations that people have from seeing this stuff. It maybe is a lot different from what you thought maybe architecture was, or maybe the kind of architect you want to be, but it's where I've sort of found myself. So.
Thank you. I don't know how we do that on here.
You can just go like that and then be. I'm curious. Has anybody thought about these questions?
It most definitely changed my point of view of what architecture could be. Like, I didn't necessarily know that you could be such, like, everything you're doing is to support or to cultivate Black people. And it kind of just changed my whole point of view on that. And not only are you supporting your people, but doing something for them.
Yeah, I think that, it's funny because I feel like, when people see my installations or whatever, they might not like filter it through that lens, but that's where it's coming from for me. And so, trying to, through the tools that I have, like translate something about my experience, like out into the world. And so these are the tools that I operate with, like I'm kind of, about form and material and like detailing and like geeking out about that as a way to set up these sort of platforms for engagements that are really like open-ended, right? And there's something kind of special about the provocation of lots of different people coming together and mixing and giving of themselves in a place. So the mechanisms by which I do that is through installation art. But I think it comes out of, my training as an architect to be able to operate at that scale. And certainly someone like Lauren, she's got a really robust, art practice, represented by galleries, like showing all over the world, winning big prizes, all this sort of stuff. But, it always comes back to that center, I think, for her. It comes back to who she is, how she situates herself within, the artistic discipline, and also her responsibility to her neighborhood and to her community. So,
Jennifer, I don't know if you can go back to some of the
yep.
kind of the architectural drawings that you had of the PS1 installation, because I want to pick up on that question and your response where you're talking about your kind of your skills or your tools. And so for all of you that are starting in architecture school, I would presume one of the things that you're going to start to be grappling with is trying to understand how drawing and construction, for example, are things that you need to kind of understand how to work with it and how to think with it and how to experiment. And I really appreciate the presentation and this lens of, you know, you're an architect, you're a designer, but you're trying to kind of put people together in space. How do you do that, right? And these drawings, and you know, there was one where you're talking about the view, or one where you're talking about how do you assemble kind of these pieces to make the space kind of have a certain outcome is a part of the work that we do. And so while, you know, architecture and design is practice, you know, may have more kind of traditional modes, you know, the tools and the skills that you use and you learn as a designer have just so many different ways that you can use it, and you can use it to the purposes of, you know, elevating your people, or making a place comfortable or interactive. It's very cool.
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, I'm very much about like architecture as a material practice. You know, I'm not like a paper architect who makes drawings and doesn't like build stuff. So, you know, to me, like the drawings are just like a means to like get to the thing. You know, it's like it's an act of translation. It's a way I can communicate with people about like what the experience might be. But yeah, one thing I didn't show was like, you know, the drawings of the details, or like in this courtyard, we ended up doing a LiDAR scan, which is a kind of imaging software that's really super accurate, you know, down to like 1/10 of an inch or something like that. So we scanned this whole courtyard. So we had a kind of 3-dimensional picture of this thing that we could dimension to. And every moment where these kind of, where is the slide that shows this? Okay, maybe it's this one. It's not a very good slide for showing this, but like every point where these things like intersect with the wall, they're supported using the existing tie holes in the concrete. So like everything is super calibrated to like the specificity of that environment to make it look like these things just die into the wall. Like that's actually super complicated. It's technically like really challenging to have this like super simple effect to make it look like it's just floating. Like you can kind of see there's a bracket here that's sort of like peeking out that's pulling off of that tie hole. You know, or being able to get this slide doesn't really show it either, but here, being able to get this huge clear span space. I mean, this is like 90 feet here. So the structure has a kind of like ambiguity in it. So these pyramidal frames that actually support the mirrors, again, it's like taking that single vanishing point and then just like distending it into a pyramid. These structures actually take all the lateral loads out of the system. And so in certain instances, they're propping up this plane, and then in other instances, they're actually hanging. So the reason this is able to be so long is it's supported on this end, supported kind of off screen over here, but then the center bit is hanging from the upper truss, which is balanced on the walls. So that's how we're able to get this like 90-foot clear span for this runway space, is because part of it is being propped up and part of it is hanging. So we work really, really closely with this engineer, Clayton Binkley, who used to be at Arup's office in Seattle and has recently kind of gone out on his own. His partner's also an architect, so I think now they're gonna go off and design stuff together. But working really closely with engineers, with fabricators, you know, trying to figure out, okay, what is the appropriate detail to get the kind of like effect that we want that emphasizes the concept. So yeah, that's a really important part of the process that I talked like not at all about, but actually is like a really huge part of making these things real. You know, or like expressing this little knife edge so it has a kind of crispness when you see this thing kind of cruising across here, or like this edge also is kind of chamfered. the supports here are also chamfered so that you get this kind of like thinness of the edge. All of these little like detailing decisions add to the kind of overall effect of the piece.
What I think is so great about the way that you kind of narrated your work for these young people is that, among other things, you sort of displayed or demonstrated how architects and a piece of architecture or public art or both can be sort of speaking to multiple criteria at the same time, and in fact always is, right? Inevitably, that, you know, therein lies the kind of lifelong task and complexity, but also like opportunities in something like architecture is especially in school, beginning to understand that what I'm making is kind of engaging, in this case, a city, a sort of space, a certain population of people, but also some ideas that have to do with culture, that have to do with art, that have to do with people who will never come to this installation, that have to do with your background and something you're interested in, so that they're not mutually exclusive, that all of those things can be happening at once, and should be, frankly. Is really is a great challenge that I think you really kept going throughout the slides.
Yeah, for me, it's like, how is the frame continually reframed, right? Like when we look at that Lorraine O'Grady piece, that art historical edge of the gilt frame, how do we reframe that? How do we change the edge? How do we move through walls? How do we distend borders, edges, as a way of opening up a kind of more capacious space for architectural practice? Because, I mean, there's a lot of ways in which it doesn't see us. And so, you know, and so like I know I'm talking in these like really abstracted, like sort of esoteric terms, but I think that you know, that's what is motivating me when I make like the real thing. You know, when I make the thing, I'm thinking about these other, I'm bringing all of those other aspects. I'm bringing my own experience as, you know, somebody who was basically told that I couldn't be an architect. And I was like, I'm here. I'm like in architecture school. I'm sitting in the room. I want to be an architect. Like, how are you telling me that like I have no history? So, you know, that visibility, moving in and out of being seen, blind spots, like the repetition, like all, you know, all those things are kind of, again, a sort of like spatial metaphor that speaks to these larger issues of Blackness, you know, for me. So.
Well, even, you know, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to ask any other questions, thoughts from the students?
You guys can put it in the chat too if you're shy.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I always forget about that. Yeah, free feel to use the chat.
Otherwise, Justin, Jerome, and I will just talk all day. But I think we're over time. But I want to make sure that.
One term that you introduced at one point that I just wanted to underline for the students, you talked about a design build type of practice. And so I just wanted to go back and explain. So there are some architects, they'll work in a firm, they do the presentations and contract drawings and specifications and all of that, and then they just hand it over and someone else builds it. Some architects kind of bring those things together and have what they would call a design and build kind of practice or approach. And so this isn't exactly that, because
it's not. No, we're not a design build practice because we don't take on that liability. But but my partner Tom, he, in addition to us having a practice together, he runs a metal fabrication company. So, you know, and he didn't know anything about metal fabrication. I mean, he's coming to that like from a sculpture background, but it was also a way for us to have more control over the production of our work. So, but yes, so there are definitely architecture firms where that's like really built into their model of like, they both, you know,
Yeah.
design the architecture and they also take responsibility for means and methods of construction, and so they manage that whole part of the process too. For us, it is actually two separate entities. So.
I just wanted to underline it because I know a few of the students here are construction science students, and so just to kind of note that that's something that some architects do get involved in directly, and that relationship between the designers and the people kind of, managing and implementing construction is a really important link as the projects show.
And I think our work, like having a really kind of direct connection with fabricators, like, I mean, it's such an important part of our practice, and being able to, I don't know, just expand our thinking too, because they have different skill sets, different types of knowledge. So I think the more that you can kind of like collaborate with, touch on, learn from, like all the different parts of the process of what it takes to put something together, is really, really important. So, if you get like a summer job, like building houses or whatever, like that's definitely gonna like, that is really, really valuable experience. And actually something that I did while I was a graduate student, I built a house over the summer. So
That's the Tuskegee legacy, right?
yeah, exactly.
There must be at least one question.
I'm gonna start calling on people. I know how to pronounce all your names now. I got you. I'm gonna be like Dwight, Morgan.
We should do that, like just random call out.
Right, no, some.
Oh yes, go ahead.
I have a statement and question, but when the first project that you showed with the mirror, how did you construct it to the point where the wind could control it and it's stable at the same time?
Yeah. So this piece. So this Skyway pedestrian bridge was existing, and so it was like really structurally robust, like it's meant to span across a road, right? So this thing is like super durable. So basically we attached, like kind of suspended our structure inside of this pedestrian bridge. So this is actually what's called a tensegrity structure, which means that all of the tensile and compressive forces are balanced. So your body is a tensegrity structure, right? You have like the bones, which are operating in compression, and then your musculature and tendons, which are obviously operating in tension. And so all of these rods were attached to the existing structure, and then they would hold this basket kind of stationary. And then here, so this is where, like, I don't know, I kind of like this part of this story, because this piece that's here is actually a U-joint, which is like a truck hitch. So this is like a part that's $100 at like Napa Auto Parts. Was part of it is kind of attached to the mirror plane, and another part is attached and threaded through the basket and attached to this counterweight. And so the U-joint can move actually like your eye moves. It can move left to right, up, down, but it doesn't rotate. So again, it's kind of like, using a detailing structure that starts to, again, emphasize this attitude about single point perspective, about converging kind of converging light to sort of a center point, to kind of emphasize this sort of single point perspective that kind of wanders in the distance. But it's a really, really like, off the shelf component. And then for hide and seek, we kind of did like longing 2.0 and sort of learned from this, used a different U-joint, and kind of concealed the structure a little bit more, just because it was in a much more public place and we didn't want people to get their fingers crushed. So yeah, see, I get really excited, like geeking out about this part of it of like, it's actually this little thing. But yeah, that's a really great question, because I think there is a certain level of just like how does that actually work? Oh, and then I would say also that we dampened the movement of these planes so that there are actually these little springs that the bottom part of the mirror is. Oh, actually, you can see it right here. Right here. There's a little spring. So the bottom part of the mirror is connected to this little spring that's attached, was also welded to the existing structure. And so as it kind of reaches its farthest extent, it's dampened when it comes back. So it doesn't just like bang.
Right.
It has a kind of like lurching, kind of swaying quality to it through this kind of, yeah, dampening of the structure overall. There are lots of like little hidden tweaky things that we did.
Thank you. I mean, altogether, I liked how you use something so simple and like expand on it. Because a lot of time I will see this and be like, okay, how can you make this creative? But then you just showed it right there. It doesn't really take much to make something extraordinary. It's not simple, but it doesn't take a lot. So I really like that about your presentation. And also when you mentioned about how to create Black spaces, before the class, I was like, how do you create Black spaces? But when you actually talked about it, it was just because you're creating for the people. A Black space is a place where it's occupied by Black people. And I was like, oh wow, I guess that's the basic of it. So I was like, okay, so it wasn't that deep, you know. But in other way, it's like thinking about the culture. So if you're not really building for the culture, then you're not really building for the people. So that's how I see it. And connecting back to like Haiti, where I'm from, or Black spaces would be considered the jardin, which is like a little garden area, or the galley, which is, I believe, is in English, and like the porch space, which is like an outdoor living room. So just thinking about that, that's my Black space, I would say. So I just wanted to share that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, you're not hearing from Jermaine Barnes through this course, but he does he has a whole bunch of research about porches. Actually, he's based in Miami, so but
we'll have to get him in here.
Yeah. Maybe he'll come.
He said he would come.
Yeah. But you're totally right. I mean, I think just you identifying those two types of spaces, I mean, there's so much richness in there. Like, think about how the garden is used. Think about how people, occupy those porch spaces. Porches are really incredible, like, kind of, space, because it's both like part of the interior, but also kind of part of the kind of public space of the street. So it becomes this really like awesome or liminal zone. And I feel like it's such a rich space for further investigation. So like, take that, like, move with that, carry that with you, you'll find ways of circling back to it. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to share their version of a Black space? It can be as simple as a kitchen table. I encourage you to look at Carrie Mae Weems' her kitchen table series of really beautiful photographs. Yeah. Professor Fluker, do you have any questions? No.
Well, no, well, it wasn't so much I think you kind of answered it. It was really a question of maybe what you learned from the first project, maybe to the next one. I'm assuming they were sequential. And I think you kind of answered it, that the project in Minneapolis came before the one that was at PS1, the installation. And some of the ways in which I think as architects and even any profession, but particularly architects and also construction professionals, in terms of the practice, right? It's actually, you're practicing, you're actually doing it as a means of maybe perfecting a process that allows you to maybe have a heads up over someone else who's maybe doing the same thing. And so that was one. The other one had to do with maybe this idea of development, because you talked about it from the standpoint of maybe that is perhaps all architecture, but also development. People, yourself, but also people that you noted were actually they produced these things. They actually kind of figured out how to package. Who had the expertise in various ways, pulling various resources together. There's a site, and then there's some type of intervention that happens, at that site. And so I think, so again, as people think about, architecture, there's construction, and there's development is out there as well, which is, is sort of, it's not quite design build, but it's actually this other thing that is really integrating quite a number of those processes. So I just wanted to just chime in with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this kind of training, it teaches you critical thinking. It teaches you about like how to be kind of a systems thinker, right? Like you have to pull sort of from a lot of different areas to like actually make something real, right? And coordinate a lot of different types of people to make something real, from, the, designer to the engineer to the fabricator to the person who's got the money to the person who's got the land to the, all those different things have to come together. And I really appreciate what you're saying, that it is a practice, right? Like architecture is sort of like in a continual state of becoming. Like we're continually iterating in this process and learning from things that we've done before. So in the two examples that I showed, it was learning about, the sort of structural complexity and the detailing of it, but also how people use this space and what their response was to this environment, and how do we kind of manipulate that to an even more heightened effect in the second project. But yeah, I mean, I know that Justin, when he gives his talk, he'll probably talk a lot more about development, but on a very different scale than the one I'm operating, which is much more intimate. But it's kind of amazing the places that you might find yourself in. Like right now, I'm working on a project in Minneapolis, brought on as an artist team, but it's for this huge development project. And part of what we're doing is these kind of public space activations, which are about sort of, connecting with community, but simultaneously speaking to the developers to actually change how they're thinking about the project, how they're thinking about the pro formas, to introduce kind of anti-racist design guidelines into the development. So, thinking about development not just as a kind of extractive model from community, but also thinking of like, how do we actually look at different ownership structures, different ways in which people can build wealth from this project. So it's been really interesting to think about, like, again, like how are some of the things that we're invested in our installation-based practice, like how might they show up in other arenas, right? Like how might my attitudes about perception and vision and movement show up in a piece of writing? How might they show up in a piece of architecture? How might they show up as design guidelines for a $1 billion development in my hometown? So like all of these things are like core motivations that you carry with you, but then they find their representation in different arenas. So to be continued if they bite, but I'm hoping they will. Justin's given me a lot of like good pointers of like how to talk to them about this, so we'll see.
Great. Well, we're in the interest of time, we'll try to maybe wrap up for today. I don't know if anyone has a burning question, but I want to thank all of you again for contributing and for presenting again today. And class, if you haven't already, you'll want to make sure you upload your reflection assignment from last week, and then we'll do the same thing with this one. We'll post. We'll have a recording. I don't know if we'll have slides, but you'll have that information available that you can reflect on, and then that will be due before the next class. Okay.
Thanks
Anything?
so much for having us. Thanks.
Yeah, and next Monday is Labor Day, so you won't have one of us for that class, but the following class, I believe it's the 14th, will be Killian Riano.
Okay, great. We'll look forward to that. Not next week, but the following week on that Monday. So thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
All right.
Great to
Thank
meet
you
you.
all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great questions as always.
Yeah,
Keep
thank
coming.
you.